The book is called In the Hurricane's Eye, The Genius of George Washington and the Victory at Yorktown. And it tells, I think, an unappreciated story in that, yes, there was the battle, the siege of Yorktown, that was the victory that led to our independence. But before that, there was a naval battle fought off the entrance of the Chesapeake, in which the British were trying to rescue Lord Cornwallis from the end of his lonely point between the James and York rivers. And if the French had not won the battle with the British fleet, they would have rescued Cornwallis, and there would have not been the victory that won us our independence. And so the French win. It's an amazing story, and it's a story I think most Americans know little about. And so for me, this story about the year of Yorktown was an exciting one that got me back out on the water. But George Washington had an incredible talent for figuring out what was the most important thing to do. I mean, most of us get so distracted by what's happening around us and go off on tangents, but it took him a while to figure it out. He didn't have that jittery, quick intelligence of a Madison or particularly a Hamilton. He was someone who really had to study a problem, but once he figured out what was the way to go, he had a real genius to just lock into it and follow it and pursue it with just indefatigable patience and resolve. And so, for example, when the Revolution broke out and he was suddenly general, he was kind of at sea, and he eventually realized, I can't fight an aggressive campaign. It has to be in a defensive mode and just hang in there. And this was completely contrary to all his instincts. But he realized, this is what I have to do. And so that's what he pursued. And then after Saratoga, the French come in, and now we have this French alliance, he realizes what has to happen. The only way we can deliver the blow that will take down England is if we have naval superiority via the French Navy. And so as soon as the French were a part of it, he pursued this with that same kind of intensity for what he called naval superiority. And and so he countless frustrations, but he kept hammering away. This is what we need to do, and ultimately it worked out. Well, I had written 2 other books about the Revolution, Bunker Hill and Valiant Ambition, with Valiant Ambition focusing on Benedict Arnold and Washington. It ends with Arnold's unsuccessful attempt to surrender West Point to the British, and his great treason. And that ended with a cliffhanger. And what I had realized is, I'm a maritime guy when you look back throughout my career. And I knew that there was a naval battle, the Battle of the Chesapeake, fought between the British and the French, that really created the circumstances that made the victory at Yorktown possible. And I had always wanted to do a tall ship naval encounter. I'm a big Patrick O'Brien fan, and so this was my chance. And so I realized with this book, this was a way to bring the Revolution to a conclusion. I knew I wanted to focus on Washington because it really was his vision that was ultimately realized. But I also, there was this naval battle at the center of it. And, what was fascinating to me, each one of my books, I'm interested in finding things that most of us don't realize about the Revolution. And this was that, Yorktown was a fait accompli, given that the French were able to defeat the British just off the entrance to the Chesapeake. No Americans participated in it. This is not the narrative most of us associate with how we won our freedom in the American Revolution. So this is really, all this added up to, this is a book I had to write. The amazing thing about this year, the year of Yorktown, this is one of the reasons why I called the book In the Hurricane's Eye, because I think a hurricane is an apt metaphor for what was going on in this year. I mean, all of these seemingly random things were happening up and down the coast. Nathaniel Greene and Lord Cornwallis fighting in North Carolina. And then there was the French and British Navy in the Caribbean and what they called the West Indies. And what Washington realized is he needed the ships from down there to come up the coast. And so it was, and he was constantly saying, this is what we need to do, this is what we need to do. And there had been a hurricane in 1780, the year before Yorktown, had actually 3 of them, devastating effects. And so the French were convinced, yes, we need to get our fleet up the coast just to protect them, if nothing else. So they were coming. But so Washington was always playing those angles. And the frustrating thing was no one had control of the situation. The French really didn't want to attack New York, which was Washington's priority. That, he wanted them to attack there. That had been the scene of his greatest embarrassment at the beginning of the war. But it made a lot of sense because that's where the largest British army was. And so that's where he preferred them to attack. But the French were reluctant because it was difficult to get into that harbor over the sandbar, and they saw the Chesapeake as an easier target. The problem was that there was not a significant-sized British army there in the beginning of the summer. Lord Cornwallis changed all that by marching up and combining with some previous forces first brought there by Benedict Arnold, and suddenly, in a random way, all the things are coming together. Suddenly there's a 7,000-man British army there, and for reasons that are still difficult to fathom, Cornwallis, who is creating a port at Yorktown, even when this huge French fleet comes in, decides to stay there. It doesn't move, and if he had moved, it would have all gone for nothing. And Washington realized all of these variables. The French just sort of said, we're going to do this no matter what. And so it looked like it was a brilliant French strategy in retrospect. But when you go through that year, you can understand Washington's frustrations and why he wanted other things to happen. And really, I think his true brilliance was when he realized, okay, this is not going to go the way I want it. They're not going to come to New York. Okay, how are we going to make this happen? And he threw all his energies into that in a way that is just fascinating and really thrilling to watch unfold. Well, it's kind of the buried theme of the revolution, I think, is water. The sea, when we think of the sea in the revolution, we think of John Paul Jones and out there over in the British Channel. And that's a great story, but the truth of the matter is it had very little impact on what was happening in America. It had great symbolic value, but it really wasn't what was happening. What was happening was Washington's attempt to establish naval superiority. But also going along there was his realization, understanding of the importance of rivers. He had grown up in the Tidewater. His whole life had been spent navigating the rivers down here, and he knew that the rivers surrounding New York, particularly the Hudson River, was absolutely essential to how things were going to go. In fact, for most of In the Hurricane's Eye, Washington is on the Hudson. And it was one of the revelations to me to realize that, we think of him as permanently attached to his horse, as a land guy. But the fact of the matter is at Mount Vernon, he had a schooner, and when it came to moving his entourage up and down the Hudson in those many years that he was stationed on the river, he would inevitably take the helm of whatever vessel was being transported. The book begins with an account of when the French envoy arrives in 1779 and is waiting to be transported down to West Point. The vessel arrives and he's astonished that A, Washington's on it, and B, he's at the helm. And this is a different Washington. And so Washington was familiar with the water, realized its importance. He was not an admiral in any way, and when asked, he said, listen, I don't know naval affairs, but what he did understand was strategy and the importance of water to this. And, we are, as a nation, have been defined by a wilderness. We think of it as the West. But before there was the West, there was the sea. That was the wilderness that defined America through the 18th century and the first half of the 19th century. And I think it's really enlightening to realize that the birth of our country, the American Revolution, that fate ultimately depended on the fact that this country is beside the ocean, because it was the ocean that ultimately was the key factor in the victory at the Battle of the Chesapeake and Yorktown. Well, naval battles are very difficult to understand, even if you're a sailor. I'm a lifelong sailor. I actually used to work at a sailing magazine where I would work with the art director to create diagrams, and I realized I needed diagrams in this book to explain what was going on. There's not only the Battle of the Chesapeake, but the lesser known, but really in its own way, just as important, Battle of Cape Henry. And that involved Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold would have been what Lord Cornwallis became in all that. But a naval battle is it's two fleets of ships of the line, and these were great big ships with crews of hundreds of people, huge cannons. I mean, we're talking incredible firepower. And what they would try to do is each admiral would try to line up his fleet in a line of battle, and and sideways to the other fleet, and they'd come together side by side and blast away at one another. They were really trying to create the seaborne version of creating a fortress. They were temporarily creating a fortress that would then blast away at the other one. And it was difficult. It's not the land. The land is solid. The sea, you have wave conditions, you have the changing wind, and the wind was always changing and a factor in both battles that I described. And it's complicated, but it's also, I find, really fascinating and thrilling, because you don't really know what's going to happen until the very end. And naval battles typically are quite bloody, but relative to land battles, not so much, because if one side's losing, the admiral can just say, "Hey, we're out of here," and it stops. And so it's funny. It has its own rhythms. It's different. But if you are a Patrick O'Brian fan, you realize that how interesting and fascinating it is, and it had such an impact on the course of the American Revolution. To Washington's frustration, Rochambeau did not share with him what he knew about the arrival of de Grasse's huge fleet from France in the Caribbean. He was under orders not to share that information, because back home, the French High Command was concerned that the American Revolution was about to fall apart, that they might have to just pull the ripcord and get out of there. I mean, it's really interesting they had come up with contingency plans. If Washington is unable to keep an army together, if the states are just, falling apart, de Grasse was ordered to sail up to Newport, where the Rochambeau's army was, and evacuate them and take them down to the Caribbean. I mean, can you imagine if that had happened? What that scene would have been like? And so those kinds of things, they wanted to see what was going to happen, and they also wanted to keep control of things. Washington was nominally the commander-in-chief of the Allied army, but Rochambeau and the French government played their cards very close to the vest. What Americans need to realize is they were in this war not because they had a great love of the American people and freedom. They wanted to get back at Britain for what they had done to them in the 7 Years' War. And they had, soon after the conclusion, even before the conclusion of that, the French Navy had set upon a program of revenge, to make themselves a better Navy. And they had done that. They had instituted their version of a naval academy. They had gone to great lengths to do that. But who knew what was going to happen? And so they were looking out for themselves. And if it was going to fall apart, this had all happened, this had gone on for much longer than they had thought. They were running out of resolve and money. And so it was either going to happen in the summer and fall of 1781, or it wasn't going to happen. And all indications were that it wasn't going to happen, but it did. And as Washington realized, looking back, it was really a miracle. There's no way Washington could have taken Yorktown without the French Navy. It would have been impossible because if there hadn't been the French Navy, the British Navy would have simply sailed into the Chesapeake, come to Cornwallis's aid, and taken him away if they had to. But the fact of the matter is Washington's army and the French army could not have supported themselves in Virginia without naval support. They couldn't have fed themselves. It just wouldn't have happened. And so the Navy was absolutely essential to all this. And Washington understood that. I mean, and yes, he wanted to go to New York. That was his original plan. That wasn't going to work. That wasn't going to happen. And what frustrated him was that the French could have gone to New York, picked up the army, and sailed them down in half the time that it took to march. That didn't happen. But once again, he said, okay, I'm going to reset, and we're going to make this happen. So, no, without the Navy, it never would have happened. Well, the British Navy had a hard-won and a reputation as being the greatest naval force in the war. They were in the world, but the French Navy had really made an effort to improve its ships and particularly its officers, and had come up with whole systems that the British Navy didn't have. And what you see is the British Navy, as they're encountering the British after they encounter the French after they come into the war, they're realizing, whoa, this is a different French Navy. They really know what they're doing, and the alarm bells were going off. And it's kind of a bitter irony where the French win the Battle of the Chesapeake. It's a great victory. It's not Trafalgar in terms of you don't have Nelson dying at the end, but when you look at it from a historical point of view, it's been argued it's the most important naval battle in the history of the world, given the consequences. But the terrible irony is, from the French side, is this is a great victory, but it really didn't do much for them because, of course, America wins, but then there is the Battle of the Saints, just months later in the Caribbean, where Lord Rodney, the great British admiral who had health problems in England, has returned, and he meets de Grasse, the great victor at Yorktown. And this time, it's the British who win in devastating fashion, forcing de Grasse to surrender in a humiliating way. I mean, this is such devastating news. Washington fears, oh my goodness, this means the great victory at Yorktown may be for no reason, because the British are now going to renew the fight. No, it doesn't work out that way for political reasons. But when it comes to the legacy of the French Navy, the Battle of the Saints humiliated all the officers who performed so nobly at the Battle of the Chesapeake. So it's a bitter legacy when it comes to France. What Washington did at Yorktown and in the year leading up to it, I think has great lessons for us today. What he had was vision, patience, and an incredible work ethic. There was no one who could outwork Washington. I mean, the amount of correspondence he's laying out there, but it was his just sheer rugged determination. Everything is falling apart around him when it comes to his own government, his own army. It's very frustrating. The American people aren't coming up with the money and food and soldiers he needs, but he's just hanging in there. And I think the lesson is, have a vision and stick with it no matter what. Don't let the currents of current, whatever distractions get in your way, because that Washington had that focus. That was his true genius, his ability to lock onto a path, and no matter what happens around him, see it to the end. And I think that's a lesson that is important today. Well, one of the things that is almost, all my books have surprises for me. I write these books not because I am a great expert in the field, but because I'm curious. I want to read a book about it, and I haven't quite found the book that answers the questions I have. And I come from a sailing background. I was a competitive sailboat racer in my youth, a former Sunfish North American champion, the VW Bugs of boats. But when I was 16, I qualified for the Sunfish Worlds in Martinique. And so I traveled there. I was the youngest participant, 102 boats. It was the French Olympic team was there, as long as a representative of the French Navy, a destroyer. But looking back, I was sailing in the very waters where de Grasse was when he arrived from France. He pulled into the harbor at Martinique, and and then, to add to this, just a few months later, by this time I had turned 17, and this was the summer of 1973, the Sunfish North Americans were at Fort Monroe, Virginia. Fort Monroe, Virginia is at the end of the point on which Yorktown is. We were sailing on the very waters where de Grasse's fleet arrived when it pulled into the Chesapeake. And I had no clue about any of this when I was a kid. I was the race course was all. History was something. I was an English major. But looking back, I have to say, in working on this book, I don't know what effect it had on it, but I knew what, I'd been on those waters. I had sailed on them. And so for me, this book, in ways I had no inkling really about going into it, became a culmination that was not only professional in terms of my interest in maritime matters and American history, but in a personal one. Just as a sailor, I'm a lifelong sailor. My kids sail. And so it came to me in a rush just as I was finishing the book, when I get, oh my gosh, yes, I've been following this plot longer than I knew.